In the dusty settlement of Cedar Ridge, where tradition held tighter than iron shackles, Sarah Mae Henderson sat alone on her wedding day. The white dress that should have celebrated love instead marked her shame, abandoned at the altar because the townspeople declared her too fat to marry. Cast out by her own family, she carried the weight of rejection like stones in her heart. But watching from the mesa above, an Apache warrior named Aiyana felt something stir within him that defied all reason. This woman, broken by others' cruelty, ignited a fire in his soul he had never known. Her strength beneath the pain, her dignity amid the disgrace, it called to something primal in him that he could not control. What happens when a feared warrior risks everything for a woman society has thrown away? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Mae Henderson stared at the simple gold band that had fallen from her trembling fingers onto the dusty church floor. The ring rolled in a lazy circle before settling against a wooden pew, its gleaming surface mocking her with promises that would never be fulfilled. Thomas Whitaker had placed it on her finger just minutes before, his hands steady and sure, his voice clear as he spoke. The sacred words, but when Reverend Morrison asked if anyone objected to their union, the entire congregation had risen as one. "She's too fat to marry," old Miss Patterson had declared, her voice cutting through the hushed sanctuary like a blade. No man should be burdened with such a wife. The words had hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, and Thomas, her sweet Thomas, who had courted her for 6 months with gentle words and stolen kisses, had looked around at the disapproving faces and slowly, deliberately, removed the ring from her finger. Sarah Mae's mother, Margaret Henderson, had sat in the front pew with tears streaming down her cheeks. But she had not spoken in her daughter's defense. Her father, stern-faced Robert Henderson, had simply nodded his approval when Thomas walked away, leaving Sarah Mae standing alone at the altar in her grandmother's ivory silk dress. The dress, passed down through 3 generations of Henderson women, had been altered twice to accommodate Sarah Mae's fuller figure. Her grandmother had worn it as a size 8, her mother as a size 12, and Sarah Mae had required the services of Miss Chan, the town's seamstress, to expand it to size 18. Each alteration had been noted by the town's gossips, discussed over tea, and whispered behind gloved hands. Now, as Sarah Mae sat in her childhood bedroom, the dress felt like a shroud. The carefully sewn seams that Miss Chan had crafted with such skill seemed to mock her with their necessity. She traced the delicate pearl buttons that ran from her neck to her waist, each one a small reminder of the hope she had carried into the church that morning. Her mother knocked softly on the door before entering without permission, a habit that had grated on Sarah Mae's nerves since childhood. Margaret Henderson was a woman who had once been considered beautiful by Cedar Ridge standards. Small-waisted, delicate-featured, with the kind of fragile femininity that men of their generation prized above all else. "Sarah Mae, you need to remove that dress," her mother said gently, settling onto the edge of the bed with the careful precision of someone afraid to disturb the weight of sorrow that filled the room. "I will, Mama, in a moment." Margaret Henderson studied her daughter with eyes that held equal measures of love and disappointment. "Your father and I have been talking. We think it might be best if you went to stay with your Aunt Clara in Denver for a while, until things settle down here." Sarah Mae understood the subtext immediately. Her presence in Cedar Ridge had become an embarrassment to the Henderson family name. Her failed wedding would be discussed for months, perhaps years, serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing sentiment to override practical considerations in matters of marriage. "And what would I do in Denver, Mama? Clara runs a boarding house. She could use help with the cooking and cleaning. It would give you purpose, and perhaps in time, distance might help people forget. As if her humiliation could be erased by simple geography, as if the shame that now defined her could be left behind like an old dress, outgrown and discarded. "I won't hide, Mama. This is my home too. Margaret Henderson's face softened with the kind of maternal concern that had once comforted Sarah Mae during childhood illnesses and nighttime fears. Sweetheart, you have to understand. What happened today, it changes things. People will talk, and that talk will make life difficult for all of us. The wedding ring still lay on the floor where it had fallen, catching the afternoon light that streamed through Sarah Mae's bedroom window. She could see it from where she sat, a small circle of gold that represented everything she would never have. Thomas had chosen it carefully, she knew, spending nearly 2 months' wages on a ring that would suit her hand and her station in life. Now it would be returned to the jeweler, the engagement broken as publicly and definitively as their wedding vows had been interrupted. I loved him, Mama. I know you did, sweetheart. And I believe he cared for you too. But love isn't always enough to overcome practical consideration. Sarah Mae wanted to argue, to insist that love should be enough, that the feelings she and Thomas had shared during their courtship should have been stronger than the disapproval of their community. But the memory of his face when Miss Patterson had spoken, the way his confidence had crumbled under the weight of public opinion, told her that her mother might be right. Evening fell across Cedar Ridge with the slow certainty of seasons changing, and Sarah Mae finally rose from her bed to change out of the wedding dress. She folded it carefully, smoothing each layer of silk and lace before placing it back in the cedar chest where it had waited for her wedding day. Tomorrow she would ask Miss Henderson to alter it once more, returning it to a size that might fit some future Henderson bride who would have better luck at the altar. The gold ring remained on the floor, forgotten in the gathering darkness, a small monument to promises broken and dreams deferred. Sarah Mae left it there as she prepared for bed, unable to bear the weight of picking it up and acknowledging its presence. Tomorrow would bring decisions about Denver and Aunt Clara, about leaving or staying, about whether the shame of her failed wedding would define the rest of her life. But tonight, she simply wanted to sleep and pretend that morning might bring a different world, one where love mattered more than the number on a dress size, where a woman's worth was measured by the content of her character rather than the circumference of her waist. High above Cedar Ridge, on the mesa that overlooked the settlement like a silent guardian, Aiyana crouched in the shadow of ancient red rocks, his war paint still fresh on his angular face. The sacred mixture of clay and ash, applied before dawn in preparation for a raid that had been postponed, now served a different purpose. It helped him remain invisible to the white eyes below, while he watched the drama unfold in their small, suffocating community. Aiyana was known among his people as a warrior who could not be controlled, a man whose fury in battle was matched only by his passion in all things. His Apache name meant eternal blossom, given to him by his grandmother, who had seen something gentle in the fierce child who could bring down a deer with a single arrow before his 12th birthday. But the white soldiers who had faced him in combat knew him by a different name, Ghost Hawk, for his ability to strike without warning and disappear like smoke into the desert. The war paint that covered his face in intricate patterns told the story of his victories and his losses. The black lines that swept from his temples to his jawline marked the number of enemies he had defeated in single combat. The red dots beneath his eyes represented the Apache warriors who had fallen under his command, men whose deaths he carried like stones in his chest. The white handprint on his forehead was the mark of a shaman, acknowledgement of his ability to see beyond the physical world into the realm of spirits and dreams. But as he watched the white woman stumble from the church, her ivory dress trailing in the dust of the street, Aiyana felt something stir in his chest that had nothing to do with warfare or vengeance. The woman moved with a dignity that seemed at odds with the obvious distress written in every line of her body. Her shoulders were set with determination even as her steps faltered, and when she lifted her chin to face the staring townspeople, Aiyana saw a strength that reminded him of his own mother, who had died defending their village from cavalry soldiers when he was barely old enough to hold a bow. He had come to Cedar Ridge to scout for weaknesses, to observe the patterns of the soldiers who used the town as a supply depot for their ongoing campaigns against his people. The plan had been simple: watch, learn, and report back to the War Council with information that could be used to plan future raids. But the wedding ceremony had drawn his attention, and the sight of the woman being rejected so publicly had awakened something in him that he did not understand. Aiyana had never felt drawn to white women. The few he had encountered during raids or negotiations had seemed weak and fragile, more concerned with their appearance than with the substance of their character. They spoke in high, nervous voices and fainted at the sight of blood, requiring protection and care that his warrior's life could not provide. But this woman was different. Even from his position high above the town, he could sense a strength in her that called to something deep in his soul. As the afternoon wore on and the townspeople dispersed to their homes and businesses, Aiyana remained on the mesa, watching the Henderson house with an intensity that surprised him. He told himself he was gathering intelligence, observing the daily routines of the white settlement, but he knew his focus had narrowed to a single window on the second floor of a modest clapboard house, where the rejected bride had disappeared. The war paint on his face felt different now, less like the sacred armor of a warrior and more like a mask that separated him from the world below. He had worn such paint into dozens of battles, had applied it with ritual precision while preparing to take lives and destroy property in defense of his people's freedom. But as he watched the window where the white woman sat in her ruined wedding dress, the paint felt like a barrier between him and something he could not name. Aiyana's horse, a paint stallion named Thunderwalker, stood patiently among the rocks below, trained to remain motionless for hours while his master scouted or hunted. The horse was a gift from his grandfather, a legendary warrior who had fought alongside Geronimo in the early days of resistance against the white invasion. Thunderwalker bore the scars of many battles, his hide marked with the thin white lines of old wounds, and his eyes held the same fierce intelligence that marked all Apache warhorses. As evening fell across the desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded Aiyana of the sacred fire that burned eternally in his village, he finally rose from his position among the rocks. But instead of mounting Thunderwalker and returning to his people as duty demanded, he found himself moving closer to the settlement, drawn by an impulse he could not control. The white woman's window glowed with lamplight now, and Aiyana could see her silhouette moving behind the thin curtains. She had changed from the wedding dress into simpler clothes, but her movement still carried the same dignity he had observed earlier. She moved like a person who had been wounded but refused to fall, and that strength called to him with a force that made his hands shake. Aiyana had never been afraid of anything in his 28 years of life. He had faced cavalry charges without flinching, had walked alone into enemy camps to rescue captured Apache children, had stood before the War Council and argued for strategies that others considered suicide. But the thought of approaching the white woman, of speaking to her directly, filled him with a nervousness that was completely foreign to his nature. The war paint that marked him as a dangerous enemy to her people would terrify her, he knew. His very presence near the settlement put both of them at risk. If he were discovered, the soldiers would hunt him across the desert, and if she were seen speaking with him, her already damaged reputation would be destroyed completely. But as he crouched in the darkness beyond the town's edge, watching her window with the intensity of a hunter tracking wounded prey, Aiyana realized that he was no longer in control of his actions. The woman had awakened something in him that was stronger than duty, stronger than tribal loyalty, stronger than the careful discipline that had made him one of the most feared warriors on the frontier. For the first time in his life, Aiyana understood what the old women meant when they spoke of love as a force that could make wise men foolish and turn warriors into poets. 3 days after her failed wedding, Mae Henderson walked to Miller's Creek for the first time since childhood. The creek lay half a mile east of Cedar Ridge, hidden in a grove of cottonwood trees that provided shade and privacy from the prying eyes of the townspeople. As a girl, she had often escaped to this quiet place with a book and a picnic lunch, finding solace in the gentle sound of water flowing over smooth stones. Now carrying a wicker basket and a small Apache arrowhead she had found near her father's fence line, she sought the same solace. The arrowhead was perfectly crafted, its obsidian point sharp enough to cut paper, its shaft decorated with the kind of precise flint knapping that spoke of master craftsmanship. She had discovered it while walking the property boundary, gleaming black against the red earth, like a dropped star. The arrowhead intrigued her in ways she could not fully explain. Its very presence near their homestead suggested that Apache warriors had been close to Cedar Ridge recently, closer than the townspeople would be comfortable knowing. But rather than fear, Sarah Mae felt a strange sense of connection to the unknown craftsman who had shaped this small work of art with such skill and patience. She settled onto a fallen log beside the creek, letting the afternoon sun warm her face while she examined the arrowhead more closely. The obsidian had been shaped with incredible precision, each tiny chip removed with deliberate care to create not just a functional weapon, but something approaching art. The balance was perfect, the point deadly sharp, the overall design speaking of a culture that valued both effectiveness and beauty in equal measure. "You appreciate fine workmanship." The voice came from directly behind her, spoken in accented but clear English, and Sarah Mae's heart stopped for a full second before beginning to race like a hummingbird's wings. She turned slowly, afraid of what she might see, and found herself looking into the dark eyes of an Apache warrior who crouched motionless in the shadows of the cottonwood trees. He was larger than she had expected, his shoulders broad and powerful beneath a shirt made of deer hide, decorated with intricate beadwork. His hair was black as midnight, worn long and straight with 2 eagle feathers braided into the left side. But it was his face that captured her attention, angular and strong, marked with the kind of weathered handsomeness that spoke of a life lived outdoors under the desert sun. War paint covered his features in patterns that should have terrified her, but instead filled her with a strange sense of recognition, as if she had seen this face in dreams she could not quite remember. The black lines and red dots that marked his temples and cheeks told stories she could not read, but their very presence spoke of a life far removed from the petty concerns and shallow judgments of Cedar Ridge society. "I'm sorry," Sarah Mae managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know this was your arrowhead." The warrior rose from his crouch with the fluid grace of a man completely comfortable in his own body, and Sarah Mae realized he was even larger than she had first thought. He stood well over 6 feet tall, his frame carrying the kind of lean muscle that came from years of hard living and constant physical challenge. "It was a gift," he said, moving closer with steps so quiet she could barely hear them, despite the dried leaves scattered beneath the trees. "Left for someone I hoped would find it." Sarah Mae's breath caught in her throat as she understood his meaning. "You left it for me." "I have been watching you," he admitted, settling onto the creek bank several feet away, close enough to speak quietly, but far enough to avoid threatening her with his proximity. "3 days ago, when your people rejected you, I felt something I have never felt before." The admission should have terrified her. Here was an Apache warrior, a member of the tribe that had been raiding settlements across the territory for decades, confessing that he had been observing her in secret. By all logic, she should be running toward town, screaming for help, alerting the soldiers who would undoubtedly come hunting for him with guns and dogs. Instead, Sarah Mae found herself studying his face with the same careful attention she had given to his arrowhead. Like the obsidian point, his features had been shaped by forces she did not understand, but could appreciate. The war paint that should have marked him as her enemy somehow made him more human, more real than the clean-shaven men of Cedar Ridge who hid their true natures behind careful civility and social convention. "What did you feel?" she asked, surprised by her own courage in continuing the conversation. Aiyana was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes studying the creek water as it flowed past their feet. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of emotion that made Sarah Mae's chest tighten with unexpected sympathy. "Among my people there is a saying, the heart knows no boundaries. When I saw you standing alone in that white dress, carrying yourself with dignity despite their cruelty, something in my chest caught fire. I have felt the pull of battle, the call of the hunt, the bond of brotherhood with my fellow warriors. But this was different. This was like being struck by lightning and surviving to tell the story. Sarah Mae turned the arrowhead over in her hands, using the smooth obsidian to anchor herself to reality, while her world shifted around her. "You don't even know me. I know that you are strong where they are weak." Aiyana replied, his gaze returning to her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed and protected at the same time. "I know that you carry pain with grace, that you face rejection without losing your dignity. I know that when the entire world tells you that you are not worthy of love, you do not believe them." The last observation struck Sarah Mae like a physical blow, forcing her to confront truths about herself that she had been avoiding since her wedding day. Did she believe them? Had the voices of Cedar Ridge convinced her that she was indeed too fat to marry, too flawed to deserve happiness, too different from their ideal to be worthy of love? "Sometimes I do believe them," she admitted, the words coming out in a rush before she could stop them. "Sometimes I think they might be right." Aiyana moved closer then, close enough that she could see the individual lines of war paint on his face, close enough to catch the scent of sage smoke and desert wind that clung to his skin. "They are wrong," he said with absolute conviction. "Their eyes are clouded by rules that have nothing to do with truth. You are beautiful in ways they cannot see because they have forgotten how to look with their hearts instead of their prejudices." Over the following weeks, Sarah Mae found herself returning to Miller's Creek every afternoon, carrying with her a small leather journal bound with rawhide strings. The journal had been a gift from her grandmother years earlier, intended for recording recipes and household management tips. Instead, Sarah Mae filled its pages with observations about her secret meetings with the Apache warrior who had turned her world upside down. The journal became her confidant, the repository for thoughts and feelings too dangerous to share with anyone in Cedar Ridge. In careful script, she recorded not just the details of her conversations with Aiyana, but the gradual transformation she felt taking place within herself. Each entry revealed a woman slowly awakening to her own worth, discovering strength she had never known she possessed. June 15th, she wrote by lamplight in her bedroom. "Today A told me about the Apache custom of naming children for their dominant trait rather than family heritage. He said his grandmother chose Aiyana because even as a fierce warrior, his essential nature was that of something that grows and flourishes despite harsh conditions. I think I understand why he was drawn to me. We are both flowers trying to bloom in hostile soil." The meetings at the creek followed a pattern that felt both natural and revolutionary. Aiyana would arrive first, emerging from the desert like a spirit materializing from the heat shimmer. Sarah Mae would find him waiting in the shade of the cottonwoods, sometimes sharpening arrowheads, sometimes simply sitting in meditation with his eyes closed and his face turned toward the sun. Their conversations ranged from the practical to the philosophic. He taught her to identify edible plants and to read weather patterns in the behavior of birds. She shared stories of her childhood, her dreams of traveling beyond Cedar Ridge, her love of books that transported her to worlds where a woman's worth was not determined by her dress size. "Among my people," Aiyana told her during their 5th meeting, "a woman's beauty is measured by her ability to survive hardship, to bear children who will continue the tribe, to contribute to the well-being of the community through her skills and wisdom. Physical appearance matters less than strength of character." Sarah Mae recorded this conversation in her journal with particular care, underlining certain phrases that resonated with her developing sense of self. The Apache way seemed radical compared to the rigid standards of Cedar Ridge, where a woman's primary value lay in her ability to ornament her husband's social position and produce children without causing embarrassment to the family name. June 22nd, she wrote, "Asked me today what I would do if I could live anywhere in the world, be anything I wanted to be. I told him I had never considered such a question because it seemed pointless to dream of impossible things. He said the only impossible things are those we convince ourselves we cannot achieve. I am beginning to think he might be right. The journal also served as a record of her growing attraction to Aiyana, feelings that she explored with the careful attention of a scientist studying a new phenomenon. She documented the way her heart raced when she caught sight of him waiting by the creek, the manner in which his voice made her feel warm and safe despite the danger of their secret meetings, the growing certainty that what she felt for him was deeper and more genuine than anything she had experienced with Thomas Whitaker. June 29th, she wrote, with hands that trembled slightly as she formed the words. Today, A told me that in Apache culture, when a warrior feels drawn to a woman with such intensity that he cannot control his actions, it is considered a sign that their spirits are meant to be joined. He said he has never felt about anyone the way he feels about me, that watching me from afar was like being slowly consumed by a fire that burned without destroying. I think I am beginning to understand what he means. The physical attraction between them grew gradually, built on a foundation of genuine understanding and mutual respect that neither had experienced before. Unlike her courtship with Thomas, which had been based on social compatibility and practical considerations, her connection with Aiyana seemed to bypass rational thought and speak directly to something deeper than conscious decision-making. She found herself studying his hands as he demonstrated the proper way to hold a bow, admiring the careful precision of his movements and the obvious strength in his fingers. When he laughed at her attempts to track animal signs in the soft earth beside the creek, the sound made her chest tighten with emotions she had no names for. And when he spoke of his childhood among the Apache, his voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of a born storyteller, she caught herself watching his mouth with an intensity that would have scandalized the women of Cedar Ridge. July 4th, she wrote, the date's irony not lost on her as she reflected on her own declaration of independence from societal expectations. A brought me a medicine pouch today, made from deer hide and decorated with beads that belonged to his grandmother. He said it contains herbs for protection and strength, but also a small piece of turquoise that represents the bond between kindred spirits. When he placed it around my neck, his fingers brushed my skin, and I felt something pass between us that was stronger than words. I think we both knew in that moment that we have moved beyond friendship into territory that will change everything. The medicine pouch became Sarah Mae's most treasured possession, worn hidden beneath her dress during the day and held close to her heart at night. Its presence served as a constant reminder that somewhere in the vast desert, a warrior who should have been her enemy instead saw her as something precious enough to protect with sacred objects and ancient prayers. But the journal also recorded her growing awareness of the impossible nature of their situation. Each entry included observations about the increasing tensions between the Apache and the white settlers, the cavalry patrols that passed through Cedar Ridge with greater frequency, the stories of raids and retaliation that dominated conversation in the general store and the saloon. July 11th, she wrote with growing unease. Today, Reverend Morrison spoke during Sunday service about the savage nature of the Apache and the Christian duty to bring civilization to the wilderness. As he spoke of their heathen practices and barbaric customs, I wanted to stand up and tell the entire congregation about Aya's kindness, his wisdom, his gentle treatment of someone they had rejected and abandoned. But I realized that nothing I could say would change their minds. They have decided that all Apache are monsters, just as they have decided that I am too fat to deserve love. Both judgments are based on fear rather than knowledge. On a sweltering afternoon mid-July, when the desert heat made the air shimmer like water and the cottonwood leaves hung motionless in the breathless air, Aiyana arrived at Miller's Creek carrying something wrapped in soft deer hide. His war paint was different that day, simpler, more ceremonial than martial, and Sarah Mae sensed immediately that their meeting would mark another turning point in their impossible relationship. He unwrapped the deer hide to reveal a medicine pouch, unlike any she had seen before. Where the first pouch he had given her was practical and modest, this one was clearly ceremonial, decorated with intricate beadwork that told stories in colors and patterns she could not read but somehow understood. The leather had been worked until it was soft as silk, dyed in shades of deep brown and rich gold that seemed to capture and hold the desert sunlight. "Among my people," Aiyana said, settling beside her on the fallen log that had become their usual meeting place. "When a warrior feels called to a woman with such force that he cannot control his actions, there are ceremonies to honor that calling. This medicine pouch contains sacred elements from my grandmother's medicine bundle, herbs for protection, stones for strength, and symbols of the bond between spirits that recognize each other across all boundaries." Sarah Mae accepted the pouch with hands that trembled slightly, understanding that she was receiving more than a gift. This was a declaration, a formal acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing between them for weeks. The weight of the pouch in her hands felt like the weight of destiny, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. "I cannot control myself near you," Aiyana continued, his voice dropping to the low, intimate tone he used when speaking of sacred things. "From the moment I saw you standing alone in that white dress, something in my chest has burned like a fire that never dies down. My brothers think I have been cursed by desert spirits. My grandfather believes I have been chosen for something that will test my strength and my wisdom." Sarah Mae studied the intricate beadwork on the medicine pouch, using the familiar motion of her fingers tracing patterns to steady herself while her world shifted once again. The blue and white beads formed symbols that reminded her of water and sky, while the red and yellow ones seemed to dance like flames across the soft leather surface. "What do you believe?" she asked. Aiyana was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes studying the creek water as it flowed past their feet toward some distant destination neither of them could see. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of a man who had wrestled with impossible questions and found answers that changed everything he thought he knew about himself. "I believe that some forces are stronger than reason, stronger than tribal loyalty, stronger than the careful plans we make for our lives. I believe that you and I have been drawn together by something that has nothing to do with the color of our skin or the customs of our people. And I believe that if I do not tell you what is in my heart, I will spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been possible between us." Sarah Mae felt tears beginning to gather in her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming recognition of something she had never expected to find. Here was a man who saw her not as a burden to be endured or a mistake to be corrected, but as something precious enough to risk everything for. The contrast with her treatment by the people of Cedar Ridge was so stark that it left her breathless. "My people would never accept this," she whispered, voicing the fear that had been growing in her chest for weeks. "And yours probably feel the same way." Aiyana reached across the small space between them and took her free hand in both of his calloused fingers gentle against her palm. The touch sent electricity racing up her arm and straight to her heart, confirming what she had suspected for days, that her feelings for this Apache warrior had moved far beyond simple attraction into territory that would change everything about her future. "My grandfather once told me that a warrior's greatest battle is not against external enemies, but against the voice inside his own head that tells him to choose safety over truth," Aiyana said. "For weeks I have been fighting that voice, telling myself that what I feel for you is madness, that acting on these feelings would bring danger to both of us. But the voice that calls me to you is stronger than the voice that counsels caution." Sarah Mae looked into his eyes and saw her own reflection there, not distorted by the expectations and judgments of others, but clear and true and somehow more real than any mirror had ever shown her. In his gaze, she was not too fat or too awkward or too different from the ideal. She was simply Sarah Mae, a woman worthy of love and protection and the kind of devotion that poets wrote about but ordinary people rarely experienced. "I feel the same way," she admitted, the words coming out in a rush before her courage could falter. "These weeks with you have been the happiest of my life. When I'm here by the creek, listening to your stories and learning about your world, I feel like the person I was meant to be all along. But when I go back to town, when I face my family and the neighbors who whisper about my failed wedding, I remember how impossible this is." Aiyana brought her hand to his lips, and kissed her palm with reverence that made her chest tighten with emotions too complex for words. The gesture was intimate and tender, completely at odds with the fearsome reputation that preceded him wherever he went. "Nothing is impossible if we are brave enough to claim it," he said against her skin. "But claiming it will require sacrifices that I cannot ask you to make unless you understand what they will cost." Sarah Mae understood that they had reached the moment where careful conversation and secret meetings would no longer be enough. The fire that had been building between them for weeks was ready to consume everything safe and familiar in her life, offering in return only the promise of something real and precious and completely unknown. The discovery came on a Tuesday morning when Sarah Mae's younger brother, William, decided to follow the mysterious path his sister had been taking every afternoon for the past month. William Henderson was 19 years old, possessed of the kind of righteous curiosity that made him an excellent student and a dangerous family member. He had noticed Sarah Mae's improved spirits, her secretive behavior, and most tellingly the way she hummed while doing household chores, something she had not done since her wedding day disaster. Armed with the hunting skills their father had taught him, and motivated by genuine concern for his sister's welfare, William tracked Sarah Mae through the desert scrub toward Miller's Creek with the patience of a born woodsman. He expected to find her meeting secretly with Thomas Whitaker, perhaps planning a reconciliation that would restore the family's damaged reputation. What he found instead nearly stopped his heart with terror. Hidden in the tall grass 50 yards from the creek, William watched in horror as his sister embraced an Apache warrior with obvious affection. The warrior's war paint marked him clearly as a hostile, one of the dreaded raiders who had been terrorizing settlements across the territory for months. But even more shocking than Sarah Mae's proximity to mortal danger was the obvious intimacy between them, the gentle way the savage touched her face, the manner in which she leaned into his embrace as if she belonged there. William's first impulse was to rush forward with his rifle, to save his sister from what he assumed must be captivity or coercion. But as he watched their interaction, noting the easy conversation and Sarah Mae's obvious comfort in the warrior's presence, a more disturbing possibility began to take shape in his mind. This was not a kidnapping or assault. This was a willing relationship between his sister and an enemy of their people. The torn piece of fabric that would ultimately betray them came from Sarah Mae's dress as she climbed over a fallen log to reach the place where Aiyana waited. The blue cotton caught on a sharp branch and tore away, a triangle of cloth no larger than a man's hand, but distinctive enough to be recognizable to anyone familiar with Sarah Mae's limited wardrobe. William retrieved the fabric after his sister and the Apache warrior had parted ways, holding the evidence of their secret meetings with hands that shook with anger and disbelief. The cotton still carried Sarah Mae's scent, lavender water and the lye soap she used for washing, innocent domestic smells that seemed obscene when connected to her obvious relationship with a savage. That evening, the Henderson family dinner table became a battlefield. William placed the torn fabric beside Sarah Mae's plate with the dramatic flair of a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. The blue cotton lay against the white tablecloth like an accusation, impossible to ignore or explain away. "Where did you get this?" Sarah Mae asked, though her flushed cheeks and nervous hands had already provided the answer. "From Miller's Creek," William replied, his voice carrying the kind of moral authority that came from catching someone in an indisputable lies. "Where you've been meeting with an Apache warrior for God knows how long." The silence that followed William's announcement was so complete that Sarah Mae could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Her father set down his fork with deliberate precision, the small clink of metal against china sounding like a gunshot in the hushed dining room. Her mother's face had gone pale as moonlight, her eyes wide with the kind of shock that precedes either fainting or hysteria. "That's impossible," Margaret Henderson whispered, though her voice carried no conviction. "Sarah Mae would never, she wouldn't." "I saw them together, Mama," William continued relentlessly, talking and laughing like old friends. "And when he touched her face, she didn't pull away. She leaned into it like a cat being petted." Robert Henderson stood from his chair with the slow, deliberate movement of a man attempting to control a rage that threatened to overwhelm his better judgment. His face had flushed deep red above his collar, and the veins in his neck stood out like cords beneath his skin. "Is this true?" he asked Sarah Mae, his voice deadly quiet. Sarah Mae looked around the table at the faces of her family members, seeing in their expressions the same mixture of horror and disgust that had marked her wedding day, humiliation. But this time, instead of shame, she felt a surge of defiant pride. Her relationship with Aiyana